Kanpai. We say
Cheers.
kanpai and cheers.
Otto,
Kanpai.
sorry. Okay. Cheers.
Cheers. Kanpai.
乾杯。嬉しい。
Welcome, Ed.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Nice to be here.
you so much for having us and making the time. Again, this is Fumiya.
Hello, mate. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
He's a huge fan of yours. And again, he really wants to extend his thank you and gratitude for making time for us today. First question he has for you is, what motivated you to become an explorer?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I'm honest, I didn't set out to be an explorer. I was in the military, obviously. I was in the Scouts before that, and when I left the army, I didn't. If I'm honest, most of my friends were getting jobs in London, becoming stockbrokers and bankers and things like that. But it was a financial downturn. It was at the beginning of the 90s. And I had to find a job that wasn't in banking, and so I went on an expedition, taking gap year students into the jungle, and loved it. It was amazing. It was using all of the nice skills from the military, without all the inherent seriousness like killing people. So yeah, I was a really lucky thing, and I stumbled into it. And I think since then, I've always just, understood that exploration is a really good tool for personal development. I think, if you constantly put yourself in challenging situations, then you're going to grow as a person, because you're constantly having to adapt and evolve, I suppose. So yeah, it's become a wholesome thing, but I kind of stumbled into it, really.
最初からいきなりもうサバイバルをするっていう形ではなかったっていうことなんですね。
No, not initially. I mean, walking the Amazon was a big expedition that I attempted doing that nobody thought was possible, and it was only during that expedition. And normally, when you go on expeditions, you take food with you, you take tents and hammocks and all of the things that you need to survive. And it was only on that expedition where it was so big that we ran out of food on numerous occasions, and therefore had to, fish for piranha and eat sort of reeds and rushes and roots and palm hearts and all of the things that we could forage from the forest. It was only then that I began to sort of think in the realms of surviving. And it was when I came back, Discovery Channel obviously made the program, and then it was successful. And they said, "Look, would you like to do some more shows?" And I said, "Yeah, but I'm not going to do another 2.5 years walking the Amazon." And so they said, "Okay, well, can you give us 2 months? And if it was only 2 months, how could we make that harder? How could we make it more intense?" And the concept was being dropped off on a desert island with no food, no water, no tools of any kind, not a knife, not even any clothes. Could you survive? And my answer to them was, I don't know, I haven't got a clue. And so they said, perfect. And it all started there, really, in terms of the actual survival. So when I started doing the survival TV, I wouldn't have called myself a survival expert at all. It was very much throw myself in at the deep end and see if I could cope.
なるほど。
All right. So this is the next question. How do you motivate yourself to go into these harsh environments? So knowing that they're harsh, how do you motivate yourself to do so?
I think my motivation, aside from the same motivation that everybody has to pay the bills, to look after their family, to bring home enough money to pay the mortgage and all of that sort of stuff. So obviously that is still there as well. I've got a little boy, my wife is pregnant with twins. I need to provide in that respect. But the actual job of being put in a remote environment and having to, I suppose, experience a bit of hardship in order to sort of overcome it, I think that's a really good model for personal self-development in life. I really do. I think that's how I sort of justify it in my head. I think it's, if you go through life without having anything happen to you, if you have no hardship, if you have no sacrifice, then you don't have to grow as much. You can just sort of trundle along at the same level. Whereas if you have really, really difficult things, you have to look deep inside for the inspiration to actually get through it. And I think gives you depth of character, and so I think that the shows I do and the challenges that I put myself through are really, really healthy, both to help me stay young, to keep me on my toes, but also to make sure that I'm constantly learning. I think the worst thing in the world would be to have a very, very boring job where I wasn't challenged and that I would just stagnate, I suppose. So yeah, the motivation is just to become the best version of myself, I suppose. Yep.
This is a very popular question. What has been the most difficult thing you've experienced during filming these series for Discovery?
Without doubt, the biggest expedition that I've done is walking the Amazon, but it wasn't, and obviously that became a Discovery Channel show as well, but it wasn't the hardest thing I've ever done. And I think the hardest thing was the 60 days on the island, and I think the reason for that wasn't because the island was particularly difficult to survive on. There were coconuts, there were crabs, there were snails. It was actually quite abundant, but it was the isolation. I'd never spent that amount of time in complete isolation before, and I didn't understand the effects that isolation would have on the brain. And I thought I would start to get lonely after maybe 2 weeks of being away from home, but from the very moment that I was dropped off on the shore, I realised for the first time that I would have to take complete responsibility for myself. And so there was no one to turn to share a joke with, or to put an arm around you or anything like that, or just to tell you whether you're going slightly crazy, you know. And it was the isolation that, I've been very open about the fact that in my book, that I had a bit of a breakdown about a year after I came back off the island, because as the psychologist said, if you want to turn a man's brain into mush, you put him into isolation for 60 days. And he said this might have been voluntary, you might have decided to do it yourself, but still the effect of being isolated from other human beings does have quite a big effect. So that was definitely the hardest thing I did, but the positive side of it is that I think that sort of isolation makes you far more self-aware than I was before, and I think it was a catalyst for real positive change and gave me the sort of emotional balance that I needed to become a dad and a father. So I wouldn't change it for anything. Yeah.
なるほど。私の好きなそのシリーズの中でコロン島、フィリピンのコロン島の挑戦があるんですけど、そこでそういったトラウマがあったにもかかわらず、島に挑戦して、でその過去を乗り越えていくっていう姿に、感動していました。
Thank you. I still can't stand the coastal environments. For some reason, they give me the heebie-jeebies. But yeah, no. Thank you for the words.
Oh, if you had to choose a single worst thing you had to eat in a survival situation, also, what was the best? So let's start with the worst.
I've eaten some really weird and wonderful things. I've eaten woolly monkeys in the Amazon. I've eaten giant armadillos. I've eaten skunk in the Sonora Desert in America. But I think the worst tasting, bizarrely, is something a little bit more, a little bit less dramatic, but it's tadpoles. If you think about the composition of tadpoles, they're literally just intestines in a little bag, and the intestines are obviously just full of poo. So it's just like eating little bags of poo, and it's just actually revolting. The best was, I think, because of the fact I never have a cooking pot, I've got quite good at cooking things under the ground and having an underground oven. And I just think, I sometimes at home we do this as a family now, and just make a fire and superheat some rocks, and then put the meat on, and then cover it over with earth, and you leave it for about 3.5 hours, so really, really slow cooked. And I think it was the goat that I caught on Olarua for the 60 days. That one, I hadn't eaten properly for about the past 44 days, and so hunger obviously makes everything taste so much better. But also the meat, if I hadn't had any teeth, you could have just bitten it off with your lips. It was extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. No seasoning, no condiments, nothing like that. But it was amazing. So yeah, underground oven cooked goat. Yeah.
すごい。今でもそうやってサバイバルで得た知識を日常で使ってらっしゃるんですか？
one of the biggest things I realized that I did on walking the Amazon was get into mental battles with myself, and I would want things that weren't possible. I'd wished the expedition was over. I would fixate on getting to the end rather than just accepting my circumstances and enjoying the moment. And I think that has been the biggest shift in me psychologically from doing that expedition to where I am today. And I think, things like lockdown, it's easy to start moaning at the government because they're not handling the situation correctly, or start complaining about one thing or another, or people in your household. But I think it's that concept of accepting everything exactly how it is, which both in a survival situation and in lockdown and in everyday life just makes it reduces so much wasted energy. You know, you just okay, this is how things are, and let's move forward positively. And I think it's that sort of positive outlook of acceptance and sort of surrender to the flow of everyday life that makes things a bit easier.
Yeah, I think this is our last question. One thing you want to try when you finally visit us in Japan?
I'm slightly intimidated by the naked baths that you guys have with each other. And so whether I actually want to have one or not, I'm not sure. But that's the thing. Whenever I think, I'm about to go to Japan, I just get slightly scared of the naked baths. So, Japanese food, I absolutely love. I used to have a Japanese fiance for a number of years actually, so I do feel a bit of an affinity to Japan, but yeah, I've never been, so it'd be a dream come true. And it's such a shame that the lockdown and the coronavirus stopped it, but it will happen again. It will happen, whether it's late this year or early next year, it will happen again. So I'm just scared of the bath.
If you're okay, I want to play a little game of Survival Pictionary. And the reason why we're doing this is because this picture of this rabbit that you drew is also very famous in Japan.
Right, okay.
So you've become kind of an artist in our country. And so we would love to see you illustrate some of the animals that you have encountered during all of your expeditions.
Wow.
All right, and so you'll be drawing. Fumiya will also be drawing.
People here.
I'm sorry?
I said I'm going to disappoint a few people here.
That's totally fine. じゃあFumiyaさんも it's gonna be a competition between you two. All right. So first animal.
Yeah. Do I have to draw this in a way that you can see?
Oh no, it's okay. You can draw it. A hedgehog.
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 Yeah.
Is that a hedgehog?
No, that's good. That's good. I think Fumiya is still drawing.
Come on, you're taking too much time.
Fumiya さん遅いですよって。
じゃん。
Oh, nice one.
Oh, that's good.
おー、うまい。うまい。
Yours looks more like a hedgehog. Mine looks more like a skunk, I think.
Very good. All right, next one.
Okay.
Ready?
OK。OK。
Buffalo.
バッファロー。
We done it yet?
OK。
Okay.
Finished?
All right.
Oh,
wow.
This is a water buffalo, I think, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it is a water buffalo.
I think I might have got the antlers a bit wrong.
All right, last one. Ready?
Yes.
A giraffe.
It's around it, yeah. Yes.
All right, giraffe. キリンどうぞ。Oh, wow.
Yes.
Wow, the detail.
うおー。
Mine has a tiny, tiny head. An apology.
そう見せるのが恥ずかしくなってきました。
Oh, what
Uh,
fun. Enough.
So before we go, I think we have one last question for you.
Okay.
私は今社会人2年目で、 メーカーの営業をしているんですけども、うまくいかないことばかりで、エドみたいに挑戦できなくなってしまう時もあるんです。そういった時に、どういう気持ちで、また挑戦する心を取り戻していけるかっていうアドバイスをいただければ嬉しいです。
Actually, the only office job I've ever had was sales as well. So I do know a little bit about how dispiriting it is sometimes when things aren't going your way. And mine was telephone sales, and so it was calling people up, and an incredibly negative experience in general. I just think nothing ever stays the same forever, does it? And it's very rare that people land into their perfect job initially, and I certainly didn't. I had that job. I was, packing mushrooms in a mushroom packing factory. I worked in all sorts of really, really rubbish jobs, washing up in kitchens for £3 an hour. But I think nothing ever stays the same, and I think it's times of hardship that actually make you the person who you are. If everything was easy, then you would be a superficial person. And I think you keep going, keep dreaming. I would say, like, whatever you absolutely want in life, keep dreaming of that and keep focusing on that. I'm going to turn the camera around actually, because I have a dream wall, and some people might find this a bit stupid, but this is my dream wall, and you can see all the discovery stuff, because I love to visualize what I want my life to be like. And I think unless you've got a sort of picture in your head of what you want your life to be like, then it's kind of never going to happen. And so keep going through the tough times and keep dreaming about the future. And it's not wasted energy, because I think that will make things come true. Yeah.
心に響くものがありました。その言葉を忘れないで頑張っていきたいと思います。ありがとう、エド。
Good luck.
So
Thank you.
before you go, Ed,
Yes.
Fumiya also wants to teach you some Japanese for when you come to Japan. So,
Cool.
What would you like to learn?
How to order a beer.
How to order a beer. じゃあ、ビールの頼み方をエドに教えてください、Fumiyaさん。
ビールの頼み方。大将ビール1丁。
Beer icho.
1丁。Yeah.
Perfect. 大将、let's say boss. 大将。
Icho. Okay. Beer icho.
CHO. So, 大将、ビール1丁。
Beer icho.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Good.
Thank you, mate. I will practice.
All right, thank you so much, Ed.
Thank you.
Thank you, mate. Bye bye.
また日本に来てください。
あ、大丈夫ですか皆さん。
いや、もう本当に夢のような時間でした。